Greetings, rabble-rousers. My name is Jessa McLean. Welcome to Blueprints for Disruption, a weekly discussion dedicated to amplifying activism across Turtle Island. Together, we will examine tactics, explore motivations, and celebrate successes in disrupting the status quo. This podcast is a proud part of New Left Media. With the very recent decision south of the border of the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, we thought it'd be prudent here at Blueprints to have an in-depth discussion about reproductive justice here in Canada. This episode is with Robyn Schwarz, and throughout it, we learned that access to abortion isn't as easy as we make it out to be. We also learn reproductive justice isn't all about abortion rights. And we also find out what steps we can take right now to secure some of those rights that we're seeing stripped south of the border. Like many of the discussions we have here at Blueprints, it's clear it's not just about controlling bodies or the patriarchy. There is a clear underlying class component involved. Let's listen and learn. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of reproductive justice, tell people a little bit about who you are and how you became so interested in reproductive rights.
Yeah, so for folks who haven't heard of me before, my name's Robyn Schwarz. My pronouns are she, her. And I wear many hats in the Canadian reproductive rights movement. I've been doing it for several years. Essentially, I was working on my PhD in Canadian history, specifically looking at the history of single moms in Ontario. But I've been a 20th century historian of North America for the last decade. And I was doing that work at Western, where there started to be a really terrible anti-abortion group. And from there, if you fast forward 6 years now, I've done a lot of just different work around this in southwestern Ontario because London is one of the most important abortion providers in Canada. So that connection, and then I worked at the feminist nonprofit Shore Center in Kitchener, which is the only Planned Parenthood outside of outside of Toronto and Ottawa in Ontario. And then through there, I was the project coordinator for choiceconnect.ca, which is the national access app that we created in partnership with the local tech community in Kitchener. I am an abortion doula, which means that sometimes I support people going to their appointments with abortions. I've driven people from Kitchener to various places. I volunteer on the National Access Line, and I'm an organizer. So I believe that these issues are connected politically, and because of my history background, I very much see how change happens when we actually engage with politics, and that all of these issues are political. And so, yeah, I always find it hard to introduce myself because it's so much a part of who I am, but it's also like, it feels like it's been a whirlwind these last couple of years organizing around this, in part because of what was happening in the U.S. Like, I just saw that my master's is in Canadian American Relations. I was really just intimately aware of the differences in the relationships between the two countries. And as an academic and someone who was working with students, it felt important to me to do what I could, and the more I learned, the more I wanted to do.
I can imagine with someone with your background and your interest and what's been going on south of us in the United States leading up to the most recent decision that, has everybody talking right now. I imagine you saw this coming,
Yeah, I did. It's been a weird, especially because I am a really big fan of the podcast Boom Lawyered, which I've been listening to, I now realize, since they launched. Their Rewired News Group is the only nonprofit news source in the United States that primarily focuses on reproductive justice and reproductive rights. And so as someone who, like, I was doing archival research and I had a lot of time to listen to podcasts, because when you're flipping through various old documents and just taking pictures of all of them so that eventually you can create a giant database of divorce case files, you have a lot of time to listen to different things. And I enjoy especially things like I was listening to Media Indigena in 2015, 2016, 2017 a lot. And Boom Lawyered was the one place where basically the two hosts are both lawyers who have been following the Supreme Court and essentially analyzing it through like these intersectional feminist lenses and the lenses of social justice. And so they don't just talk about abortion. They've been talking about various cases because it's all connected with the mission that the Federalist Society, which for people who don't know, is the far-right legal group that has been basically installing these justices and these bills. So if you look at like which schools the far-right justices went to, like they're all connected to this one organization that is a Christian nationalist legal society. And so because of that, I've been listening, like that podcast has been weekly, sometimes monthly for years. I've just had this really clear understanding because of how smart these two women, Jessica Mason-Piccolo and Imani Gandhi, are in terms of explaining this. But then I also, as I just said, was studying legal history in Canada. And so like it was very much in my interest area in terms of being able to understand something like that, because that podcast is very nerdy and very, very funny. Like they make a lot of jokes, and even when like Justice Anthony Kennedy retired and we knew that someone like Brett Kavanaugh was about to be appointed to the court because Gorsuch's appointment when Trump was first in office, that's the person who replaced Anthony Scalia, was just replacing Scalia, right? So, like, we're replacing, like, one with one, or, no, who is it? Gorsuch coming in was a big, like, basically, he's a terrible person. I'm not saying that he's not also evil, but, like, Brett Kavanaugh was a different level of extremism because of the types of things that the Trump administration had been doing in order to move the line on what was normal within the legal apparatuses of the United States between those 2 years. And so as soon as Justice Kennedy announced his retirement, which he is the one whose legacy was gay marriage, like he was a more centrist judge, but definitely like very pro LGBTQ rights, but not an ally on women's rights in the same way. As soon as that decision was made, and it seemed kind of sketchy, at least that's what they were talking about at the time, in terms of like, unlike say someone like RBG, who probably, like, folks are right, she probably should have retired earlier, but at the same time also was mentoring these young female justices like Sonia Sotomayor. And so like one person isn't responsible for that, but at the same time, like, that's where, like, it was very clear pressure had been put on someone, and that, because Kennedy was never planning on retiring. And so anyways, that moment, and then RBG's death and them rushing Amy Coney Barrett through before the election in 2020 was essentially where that podcast was saying this was going to happen. And so, and then they actually called the fact that it was going to be Dobbs as the case, because so many cases were coming up the Supreme Court docket as state-level conservatives tried to be the state to pass the bill that ended Roe, because Trump had just packed the courts so much with all of these Federalist Society justices. Not even, like, people talk about the Supreme Court, but it's actually the circuit courts and, like, the lower courts that are allowing this stuff to float up. Yeah, so all that to say, I wasn't surprised, but I also... I think I continue to be shocked, even though I shouldn't be, at how little fight the Democrats with power are putting up. Like, even as we were preparing to talk tonight, I saw them talking about how they're not going to end the filibuster again because of Manchin, and it's just like... hey, we can't keep being nice to these people, guys, but here we are. So anyways, that's, no, I wasn't surprised, but I also, the leak was shocking. I think the leak of this was in early May. Not because, like, leaks are, in terms of, like, a leak from the Supreme Court is unheard of. Like, that's very, very, very much something where, like, there's so much institutional, like, reverence by the people who work there, in particular, like, their clerks. Like, and so many rules and things that, like, you're expected to do in order to work in those places, in especially the left. That, yeah, I was surprised to see that happen, just because I would have thought that they, being the anti-abortion movement, wouldn't have wanted us to know that this was coming, but who knows, right? Like, that's actually a question I have, is, like, who leaked it from which side and why? And that's very much me going back to my undergrad history self of being obsessed with Watergate, because I just think it's fascinating. I just think it's fascinating. It's such a weird, like, 2 years of, like, who did what and why and how can we prove this is, like, history crack to my brain. Like, it's this to my brain. That's a terrible... Edit that phrase out. But it's, like, it's very fascinating to me with my ADHD and, like, the hyper focus of, like, ooh, like, espionage and, like, who actually did this. And I feel that kind of similarly about this, where maybe one day we'll get some cool movie, if it's a hero. If not, we won't. Of, like, someone releasing this case.
Like, I totally get everybody focusing on it. And yeah, like, you're right, it's been a bit of a drama over the last few years. And some folks saw the writing on the wall, and, you know, some folks acted completely shocked. And, you know, I think it is a bit of a gut punch. But while we're all focused on the United States and the decision there, I think, you know, it's critical that we take a look at Canada as well. I would imagine that most people, we have this tendency as Canadians to point fingers at the United States and always look a little chuff and say, well, we're okay up here. Like, there's nothing to worry about. But, you know, I interviewed a guest on New Left Radio, Genevieve Easterbrook, and it was very eye-opening to hear the limited access that exists across Canada, especially rural and Indigenous communities. PEI is without a clinic. New Brunswick is limited to 3 that are in hospitals in urban settings only. So this was somewhat news to me. I think it would be somewhat news to other people as well. Can you touch on that? You know, what else would kind of shock people about Canada? And do we have reason to worry it would get worse than it already is?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing, and this is just me dropping in, the first thing I ever learned about this that really was the kind of historical fact that motivated me to start volunteering in this work in 2016, because I was I was getting divorced. I was going through my PhD comps. It was a really hard time. And my therapist was like, you should volunteer somewhere because you need something outside the university, because all your friends and work and life and school are all here. And I was like, that seems good. And at the time, I didn't share this publicly, but I had had an abortion while I was living in Scotland on exchange as an undergraduate student in 2011. And I've since written about that. Like, this is not a secret. I published my abortion story as a part of the 2020 Abortion Caravan project that I co-edited. And from then, from 2011 until I learned this fact that I'm about to say in terms of shocking things, I carried a lot of internalized shame and stigma with me that was imposed upon me by the evangelical conservative community that I grew up in. I am from Kelowna, British Columbia, which is the home of Stockwell Day. And for folks who are on the left listening to this, you will know Stockwell for riding the Sea-Doo in the 90s and doing that. He had a Sea-Doo on the lake for some stunt. That was my lake. I live near that lake. And grew up near that lake. And so one of the most heartbreaking things that ever happened to me around that was I came back and had to go stay with a friend in Vancouver to redo a lifeguarding certification that I needed, like a recert, because I had been one of the head lifeguards at the pool here. And that was like the way I paid for my degrees and all this stuff. And so I went down and I had not told a bunch of people because I knew you don't tell people you're having an abortion. And for me personally, I had done everything right, quote unquote. And that's something we can also get into because after, like, a lot of my journey through this has been learning how much, like, even myself, like, I talk in that piece for the 2020 Abortion Caravan about how I sat there judging the young woman across from me because I was there having an abortion with an IUD in, and I had done all of it, everything. And what was this other person across from me and how she looked? Like, what had she done to, like, cause this to happen, right? And so, but those were feelings that I had in myself that I didn't know because I hadn't, like, unless you interrogated. I often talk now about how if I got pregnant today, like, I don't want to be a parent. I've made that decision based on a lot of the reproductive pain I've had in my life with IUDs, with abortions. Like I just have had the worst luck with my uterus, and so I'm just not interested in, like, seeing what happens if we, like, grow a human being in there. But I told one of my best friends from high school who I was staying with for this lifeguard recert, and that was a really big deal because I hadn't told very many people in my life. I did tell my mom. I called her crying from the hospital at like 4 a.m, being like, this is what's happening, because they thought I might have an ectopic pregnancy, and I had to stay overnight. I didn't, thankfully. And for folks who don't know, an ectopic pregnancy is when the pregnancy is in the fallopian tube, so that can be very dangerous. That's what's being talked about a lot in terms of doctors in the U.S. seeking legal consults around those, which is, like, absolutely ridiculous, and they need to just, like, do a Henry Morgenthaler and save people's lives, for friggin' sakes. But basically, I told this friend of mine, and I was like, hey, this happened to me, and it was a really big deal, and I was, like, pregnant for this whole month, and he turned to me and said, what do you mean? Why wouldn't you want to be a parent right now? And I was 21. And so that lesson that I learned was you never tell anyone, because if you tell people, they will make you feel crappy because they don't understand. But then I was in history and all the stuff had happened, and I learned there's a really great article that is on the Canadian history syllabus at Western that I used to teach about the history of birth control in Canada by Agnes McLaren. And it's an older article. I think it came out in the 80s or early 90s. But it basically looks at, like, different types of birth control. So it's really fun to teach students, like, 19th century, like, what different materials and things did they use, and different ideas around pregnancy. But the big piece that I took away from there that actually gave me so much peace in terms of reinforcing what I knew to be true but had been told was not by my evangelical conservative community, where they still protest every single Tuesday outside the hospital, and there is a bomb door on our abortion clinic here in Kelowna because of how dangerous it is that pregnant people in Canada, what is now Canada, did not believe that abortion was wrong until the state criminalized it in 1892. And really not until the 1910s and 20s, when then white male doctors, through the rise of the professionalization of the medical sector and the professional, like we talk in Canadian history about the modernity and that time, like, what does modernity mean, and the ways in which the state in Canada is being formed, and professions like social work becoming a real thing, and teachers and just all, and doctors are a part of that, right? Like, the medical profession is set up from about the mid 1800s to about the 1930s in terms of what we understand doctors to be today. And through that process, white male doctors from privileged backgrounds decided that poor people, marginalized people, racialized folks, Catholic people in Canada were having too many children, and that white, middle, and upper class, Protestant, respectable women were not having enough children. And so they started to tell people, and this is part of a broader, like, international push through the eugenics movement of the 10s, 20s, and 30s, where many of the things we're now hearing from folks in the United States and Canada on the right are coming back. The idea that somehow the poor are like that there's a fear of this racial suicide, that if white middle and upper class women are not having enough kids, that somehow Canada, as we know it as the great country, because then Canadian nationalism is so built around this sense of Britishness that is so extreme and so much more white and civil than anything that even exists in England. Like, it's like all the people who wanted to be extra terrible left and more rule followers and formed Upper Canada. And it's just baffling in that way. And so essentially what I was reading was that pregnant people and women like me never thought abortion was wrong until a doctor told them that. And I'm sorry, and that we didn't believe that life began at conception. We believed that life began when you could feel the fetus move around 20 weeks. And that's still kind of, in my experience with, like you mentioned, Dr. Easterbrook, like the different types of abortion, which I'm sure she would have talked about a little bit in terms of like the further into pregnancy you get, the more complicated the procedure is. In the same way that, like,
you'll have access to it.
Exactly. Less likely access, but it's also just like more complicated. Like you need more skilled surgeons. There's a doctor in the United States that we actually send people to from Canada if they're after 24 weeks because the procedure is not widely available here, named Dr. Hearn, who his best friend was the last doctor who was shot in the face in the United States in 2009. This doctor is 80. I refer to him as the Jesus of abortion, and I'm not religious, but that is who he is, because all he's been doing is he's the person you send people to if no one else will help them. So he meets with every single patient one-on-one. He looks at all of their stuff. He's been doing this for decades, and then he will help them even if they're later. And these are like the most heartbreaking stories that you could possibly imagine. Like people who, like no one, I think that's like another thing just in terms of myths of things that most people don't understand about talking about abortion, is that no one wakes up at 20 weeks with a willing, like if you know you're pregnant, which like, I'm sorry, think about all the stressors that all of us have gone through. It is also possible to not know you're pregnant for that long because your period is messed up and you're working 3 jobs and you're just hoping so hard that this isn't it. And you're 18 and you have no idea, and your mom's going to kill you that you had sex ever, right? Like that is an experience of people I've helped get procedures and get to places like London, Toronto, Vancouver, like the sites that do the later procedures. But yeah, if you're after a certain point in Canada, the access is very much on a, can you get a doctor to help you? And if not, you're flying to Boulder, Colorado to see Dr. Hearn. And it's a 4-day procedure and we figure it out. That's the access line that I help Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights. I'm one of their volunteers and I've been on there for 4 years. And most of us are all like high-level reproductive health people. Like there's a former midwife, like it's all people who just like understand how hard this is, but get the system so well that we can make magic happen in 24 hours when you need a rushed passport, which I've paid for out of pocket for multiple people. Because sorry, if you don't have a passport, you can't get that procedure. And like, I've been thinking so much about the arguments around passports that folks are having with their friggin' vacations. And I just want to say, like, the privilege, wow, to be able to, like, have that be your, because I've had to take people into passport offices before and be like, hey, okay, we're going to drop $250 on this because you need it tomorrow, or else you're going to be a parent.
I want to ask you, that just kind of clued me into something. When we saw the passing of Roe versus Wade, I saw a lot of people on social media. It was a trend, especially on TikTok. Women are implying that they would help a U.S. pregnant person cross the border, stay at their home, and, you know, it's done under the guise that they would go camping for a few days. But the understanding is that you could come up to Canada, get an abortion, no matter what, stay at a stranger's house. And this was somehow a way of helping U.S. women. I think that demonstrated to me a lack of understanding of the current situation in Canada. But I mean, have you seen these videos and kind of like a follow up to that? Like, sorry to pile on, but it's related. Planned Parenthood in Montana, is kind of responding to this kind of activism, if we can call it that, and saying that they would actually deny abortion care to folks coming in from states that had banned abortion. So what do you make of this kind of cross-border solidarity solution, since you are talking about sending patients to the US to get service?
Yeah, well, so I'm working on a piece that will hopefully be published in Ricochet in the next week or so, and I continue to say this, and then I'm like, sorry, editor, because I've been doing so much media, and also just like I put a lot of pressure on myself with my ADHD when I'm writing. Like, this piece is really important to me, and it's important to me because what it's going to say needs to be said in terms of both of the 2 points you just brought up. And it's that, so getting into reproductive justice, which I know is what we're here to talk about, and sort of what I would classify as the difference between just reproductive rights, which is the right to bodily autonomy, the right to access an abortion, the right to have that free from stigma, like that's a piece of it. Reproductive justice takes that and puts it in the framework of human rights as a movement. And that happened in response to, and folks continue, like I hear often, because reproductive justice is something that you will learn about in classrooms at the university level. Like I know there are classes on it at some schools. I know that like gender studies departments, some of them, like a lot of PhD candidates who are in these areas will then like teach a 1 semester course on that. And so it's not that people aren't learning it. But I think that what I'm not seeing in terms of, and it's not that there are small pockets of it, like people like me, I see like there's different programs and things that are happening on both sides of the border. But essentially, reproductive justice starts because in the mid-90s, President Clinton and his wife Hillary are trying to put healthcare in place, and they do not want to talk about abortion. And so Black women are meeting with Clinton, women who are part of like the southern United States, doing sorts of maternal health work in particular, because for folks who don't know, the United States has some of the worst health outcomes for Black women. Like, it is more dangerous to stay pregnant as a Black woman in terms of your health outcomes than it is to get an abortion by, like, I can't remember the percentage, but it's by a lot. Like, it's
That's
a very
horrifying.
High stat. It is horrifying. And so basically that's their issue. This is very much grassroots women who are in the clinics doing the work in these abortion clinics in the South when what is happening is Operation Rescue starts. So Operation Rescue is the most extreme anti-abortion movement in the United States. They're the ones who bomb clinics, and they start to see abortion providers as criminals and as like it's God's will to kill them. So these Black women are like the staff at these clinics. They're not necessarily the providers. They're activists, they're advocates, they're people raising money. And they have a meeting with the First Lady to talk to her about the healthcare plan. And they essentially say, like, where's abortion in this? Like, we need this in here because of the health outcome stuff I just told you, and like how important and how expensive it is to get an abortion in some of these communities. And the response is essentially, well, we'll get there. Or, well, that's not, it's just important that we get healthcare started, right? And that's right in before the UN's population conference in Cairo, which also happens, I believe it's 1994. And so these Black women, one of whom was Loretta Ross, who I'm going to talk a little bit more about later because I've been doing courses with her for the last couple years. She's this incredible Black feminist who coins reproductive justice officially, but like she has said and will say like it is not about me, and like would not want me to just give her credit for it. But I know in academic settings, like because we have to give one person a name for something, like she gets the credit. But essentially they come together as a collective and form Sister Song, Women of Color Reproductive Justice, which is the reproductive justice like organizing advocacy group that is they're technically North America wide, but mostly United States based, to essentially say, hey, this is a problem, and there are different access points, like you just said, where there's hypocrisy in the clinics. Like there are people who are not doing what they say they're doing. There are really great providers who are literally self-sacrificing, like Dr. Hearn and Dr. Tiller and all these people, and these incredible Black women and midwives, but we do not have the bodily autonomy that we deserve within this system that you're trying to create for us. And so what I am trying to sort of fast forward to what I was saying about that piece. So since then, that this happens in 1995, and it's defined as reproductive justice is three things. It's the right to have a child. So that includes things like IVF. That includes things like access to healthcare that's really good for your pregnancy. So like choice around place of birth, choice around like the type of like provider you want to have. Like these are all things that even like if we were talking about Ontario, like I would say we don't have these things. Like depending on where you live, it depends on how good can you even get a midwife. You don't know, right? It's the
I
right
didn't
to
have a choice in my OBGYN. Right? I had one choice. That was the only person available.
And that's not choice. That's not a choice. Like, because what if you hated that person, or what if they had like done something to you previously in a pregnancy, right? Like what if it was your second or third, and this is like the only OB in the community, and that's like, or what if they're anti-abortion? Like, because sorry, do you know how many anti-abortion OBs there are in Canada? There's a lot of them. It's really scary. And there's anti-abortion midwives too. Anyway, so these are problems, right? Like these are things where like that tells me that the leadership is not tackling these issues in terms of teaching and educating and calling people in and like, because the classroom is where those actual conversations have to be happening if you're going, and like continuing medical education and things. But anyway, so that it's the right to not have a child. So abortion, to access to tubal ligations, which we also know, like oftentimes young women in particular are told, what if you want to have a kid one day? Like it's like the number of times I've heard that from friends or just people in my life who like talk to me about these things. And then it's the right to raise those children in a safe and healthy community, which then connects it to all of our other social justice struggles, whether that's economic racism, like we're talking about the South in the United States, like the number of like factories and things that are placed next to Black neighborhoods where like those families get poisoned and all, like these are all connected. And so they essentially come up with this framework to say, this is what we need to do. Like they sit down, they have a long meeting, there's many arguments, and they come out of that meeting, and this is what they're like, this is what we need. And they've been organizing for it since, collectively across the United States. And so in Canada, that concept has started to pop up in academic spaces from folks like me who study this stuff, and because like you can't be an academic in Canada and not like understand the US scholarship. It's just like, unless I guess you could be in it, but most fields no. Like it's just like we're connected. We live on the same landmass, guys. Sorry, it's not. I wish I could do something about it, but
I doubt it goes the other way, though. For American academics.
You know what? It actually doesn't, and that is a fascinating, total question I can actually answer for you, because all I did for a year from 2012 to 2013 was read everything written on the Canadian-American relationship. I'm not joking. And there's like 2 books written by Americans on us on that, and everything else is by us. Everything else is Canadians writing about the U.S. But like it makes sense. I don't know.
No, I get it. It's the sleeping next to the elephant.
Even though we need a better quote, Jessa. Like we need someone else. No. I'm saying like I genuinely have that quote in the article I'm working on this, which is what I'm trying to get to say. So essentially, Reproductive justice is put out there into the universe. Pew, pew, pew. It's awesome. It's centers the experience of people of color. Like, that's the whole point, is that, like, if it's not led by people of color, it's not reproductive justice. So I personally am very careful. I do not say that I say that I do reproductive justice-based organizing, because it is not about me, because I am white. I am definitely a part of the, like, queer community on that side, and then the neurodivergent community, and that is why I've had struggles around access for these things. But my bodily autonomy is not violated the same way as someone who is Indigenous in Canada. It's just not. And so that has to be the center of everything I do and everything I say. So there's this incredible activist in Canada who writes this amazing piece in 2012 about reproductive justice in North America. Her name's Jessa McLean. I don't know what ends up happening to her after writing this blog post, because essentially Jessa McLean founds what is now the Native Youth Sexual Health Network with a collaborative of Indigenous youth. That organization is Toronto-based, but it is Turtle Island wide. And they do just really cool sex ed and sexual health stuff at the youth level on reserve, and in urban settings for Indigenous communities. And so Jessica writes this essay that is considered by historians to be the first thing on reproductive justice written by a Canadian, that is called Reproductive Justice for You, for Me, for Always, something. And it's literally a blog, Jessa. Like, it is on the Wayback Machine or something. Like, that's how, like, it's just, like, put up there. And she presented it a couple times and published in the Toronto Star in some way. But then she has kids and disappears. And I assume she's just off living her best life. And I wish her all the best, because I, too, wish I could be done with this bullshit. But she writes this essay calling on a vision for reproductive justice and saying that Canadians, basically that she has never seen herself in these spaces in Canada, in the abortion rights movement, and that essentially, she connects it to, residential schools, the ways in which, colonization has done so many terrible things to her community. And that piece, with it writing back to, the incredible Asian scholars who were writing about these things in the 90s, and the Black women in the United States, it's all a part of this beautiful scholarship that exists around this stuff. But in the Canadian context, I have seen a little bit of movement where some organizations are starting to do more. So, Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights is really trying to take a reproductive justice-based approach to their communications and things. And I've seen that change. I've been a part of it. I've been holding them accountable as a volunteer, and they are working as much as they can within a nonprofit in that way.
What does that mean, for folks listening? What changes do you see?
I see, for one thing, they're calling out the ways in which Roe versus Wade reinforces issues around reproductive labor in the United States, and the ways that, Black women's labor has been at the basis of the entire economy of the United States forever. And they name that in a statement in the UN in partnership. So that is a very good thing in terms of not just talking about, abortion access in Canada as though it's the same for all women or all pregnant people. We need to name this in terms of highlighting, the actual disparities that communities of color face in our country. And also the other thing that I've seen them do that is very promising is in the Canadian setting, a lot of our anti-choicers are moving into anti-trans work first, because I think that they see a lot of success happening in terms of just school board discussions and things. We've seen that in Toronto. I know in Waterloo, where I am based in Waterloo region, our district school board just had something come up about critical race theory, just stupid things that basically right-wing groups are trying to get right-wing parents to do. And so, like, actually naming those things, I think, is really important, because a lot of nonprofits don't do that. They just talk about these things in a vague way rather than using specific examples of things that are happening in our communities right now, and then working to build capacity for the people in those spaces, rather than it being extractive. And I know they're very early in that process, so I don't know what it's going to look like, but that was based on feedback that a number of us in the movement gave them in terms of things we wanted to see. And I do see with their new strategic plan and stuff, like, things are moving. And to give a shout out, Frederic Chabot, who is the manager of public education manager, director of education or something at Action Canada. I can't remember what Fred's title is now, because she's been there forever. She's fantastic, and just really someone who is doing the background work necessary to be able to actually, like, speak to these issues and elevate different voices, particularly, like, women of color working in midwifery and those sorts of things. So I see it happening, but it's very early, because Action Canada is a very young organization, even in the Canadian context. They've only been around for like 8 years now. They were the merger of a couple organizations that did abortion rights work, and then basically funding cuts under Harper and various things made it so that they had to make those decisions. And so I think they're hopefully doing some of it, because the access line until recently was not funded in any way. It was something that basically, like, the phone number that you call to figure out where to go for an abortion in Canada, just run by a bunch of volunteers, and then one part-time staff member who, same thing, shout out to Britt Neuron, lovely human, now works for Women in Gender Equity Canada. They managed the access line for 6 years and did tons of incredible work to help people access abortions, but really felt the burnout from that responsibility. And I think that's where what I am trying to say is that I'm working on a piece for Ricochet that builds off of what Jessica Yee Danforth said, that calls for white women in particular, because a lot of my work since Hillary Clinton's loss and my realization that my liberalism was a big problem, because I'm from a conservative town. Literally, no one here is NDP, or left. Like, it's really weird. And as in, like,
so
I met
liberal
the, like,
was
2 people.
left to you.
No, 100%. We elected a liberal once. It was like literally in 2015, we elected one liberal, and I was like, oh my God, like, Christmas is here.
The commies are moving
because,
in.
like, I know. But anyways, so all of these things, like, I think because of my education, understand my position to privilege, and I really try to keep that up. I ongoing am constantly learning and listening and trying to figure out where I fit in this big picture, because I'm a historian. And so I'm trying to write something that is essentially talking to those people you mentioned who are trying to open their homes, but also talking to people in our movements, because I see very clearly, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but I don't know if I will be, and that's going to be really, really crappy. I think that Canada's 30 years behind on the trajectory that the United States is. I used to think we were ahead, but I think that was me being naively Canadian exceptional, because my own research into Canada's divorce law shows that Canada's legal system around divorce is 30 years behind the rest of the Western world. So, example, in 1968, it became legal in Canada for the first time to divorce someone in the case of abuse, ever.
When you say we're behind...
So when I say we're behind, basically what I'm talking about is, so Canada updates its divorce laws in 1968. That same change in terms of recognizing that, abusing women is not okay, and maybe that's a reason to leave a marriage or desertion. The United Kingdom and the US make those changes in the 1930s. It takes our people, one of the folks, if anyone is nerdy enough and wants to learn about a really cool person in Canadian history who is a leftist, or at least an interesting leftist, just someone I'm fascinated with. His name's Arthur Roebuck. He becomes a senator, and he's like 90 when he does this stuff around divorce, because prior to that, divorce used to be a national legal issue for some provinces. And so, like, if you lived in New Brunswick, you had to write the Senate and be like, hey, my husband cheated on me, please, because adultery was the only reason you were allowed. And that was the system we had in the 1960s in Canada until that changed. So
what changes do you want to see happen then? Like, when I was talking to Dr. Easterbrook, they weren't sure whether, legislation is the answer, or what the answer was in terms of like law and politics.
So when I say 30 years behind, I'm not talking in abortion. I want to be very clear, and I'm going to say this very, very clearly. Canada does not need an abortion law. The idea that we need an abortion law is anti-abortion propaganda. It comes from the anti-abortion nonprofit in Calgary called We Need a Law, which is the legal arm of the anti-abortion movement. But when I say we're 30 years behind, what I'm actually thinking about is Hillary Clinton. And I'm thinking about a lot of white women in the United States who are probably feeling pretty stupid right now, for the same reason that I felt really stupid the morning after Donald Trump won. And I literally had told all my students, like, no, of course, this is never, like, because you're teaching this stuff, and of course students are asking you questions, and then I have to teach them that day and explain to them how this happened. And my own profs don't know, right? Because no one, quote unquote, saw it coming. But what I'm saying is, in terms of our understandings of where we're at with our social and political change and our institutions,
our wave of feminism.
It's complacency. It's very much like, you look at what happened with Idle No More and how incredible that movement was, and the leadership of those Indigenous women, and how that continues in terms of land back and the momentum that is happening in those spaces. That is not, like, we are not connected with them. Like, and when I say we, I'm talking about the reproductive rights movement. Like, I don't see, like those pieces aren't there in terms of shared solidarity. And I know there are people who are going to hear this and say, well, what do you mean? Like, of course I show up for things. But, like, the risk is different, right? Like, me tweeting something and saying I support this Indigenous community member is not an action. That is, like, Twitter has a place in my activism, absolutely. The place is connecting with other people like you and other people who, like, care about this stuff and are sharing information with each other, really. But it is not the place, like, I don't consider my digital organizing to be the same as the type of stuff that I do when I'm standing at a table at Western University beside the anti-abortion movement. Like, it's just not, it's not the same work. I'm able to, in that setting, like if we have a pro-choice table that's set up next to the anti-abortion club, I wrote a piece for the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada's newsletter with Madeline Vork, who is my co-organizer from Western. She was the undergrad, I was the grad student. We united. She was the chair of the Gender Equity Network at the time. And we would just, like, put these tables together, not because we were trying to be like, we're going to defend abortion. Because that's the other thing. I want folks to understand that I actually don't believe in debating the other side. Like, that's the other thing. I don't think we need to debate them. I actually think that debating them and platforming them, you have no idea how many times, usually men, but sometimes not, students would come up to me at our pro-choice tables, which our pro-choice tables included things like accurate information about abortion, accurate information about sex ed, condoms, fun pins that you could wear to make yourself feel better because you just got harassed on your way to getting your coffee. Just, like, nice things that made people feel good and, like, feel like being on campus was okay, and that, like, if you had an unplanned pregnancy that, like, someone would be there for you, which, again, obviously for me, I was thinking about myself because, like, even though, like, I didn't write about my abortion until 2020. Like, that was the decision that I made in that year to be like, no, I'm going to say it publicly, because before then I was afraid in doing this stuff that anyone knowing that would discredit me, because I know how women activists get seen as emotional, get seen as this. And, like, now that I know I have ADHD, it's even more, like, I understand it more intimately. But I always knew deeply in my soul that if my own students who, when I was teaching, like the article I mentioned earlier about condoms, like early condoms made from like various animal skins and things, I knew if I talked about my own abortion that I would lose them. Because I knew that in some case it would be okay. And I think I do, like, my memories are obviously sketchy because of ADHD, and I've had so many students and so many conversations about this with students. Because when I was TAing, like, if you came to my office, I'd be happy to talk to you about this one-on-one privately. And I would talk to you like everyone, I'm sure folks will remember last year, all of the violence that happened at Western around O Week with the sexual violence that was happening in residences there. Like, we all knew that stuff was happening. Like, that's nothing friggin' new. Do you know how many female students came up to me to talk about dating culture at Western and how frustrated they were about it and how, like, disappointing it was? Because, like, my students, like, sorry, women in history are nerds, guys. Like, just to be very clear, like, I am a huge nerd. And in order to, like, be in that field, especially in the last decade when getting a history degree has gotten you nothing, like, I got my job, like, I could have had my job without this degree, right? Like, it's like, genuinely, like, it has, like, my job right now, I use history every single day, writing grants for a mental health nonprofit in Cambridge. I love it, and doing comms for them, and equitable and inclusive comms that are actually, like, accessible, i.e. someone with a grade 3 education can read it. Yeah, wow, what a concept to, like, make sure that the stuff you're making actually makes sense for the person coming in who doesn't have the bachelor's degree, because there's just this divide. But all that to say, like, I knew that would open me up to criticism and attack, because anytime that you bring yourself into academic spaces, but especially history, you will get, someone is going to say something that absolutely is just so mean. Yeah, I just knew that would open me up to harassment, because I was always very outspoken with my views around history, and that would open me up to male students questioning my expertise. And that's a regular thing in history. Like, I was on the Active History's podcast, which Active History is a really cool website that just has really awesome history posts by historians who, like, do care about the community and want people to be able to, like, access history in a way that is, like, makes sense and connects with their lives. And so getting to go on their podcast earlier this week was really cool for me, because I've loved their work forever. But yeah, it just, like, the ways that that discipline, like, history is just it's a hard place. It's a very conservative still. Even the women are conservative, but they don't realize they are because of where the line is in terms of the discipline itself. And so, and Western is a very conservative school, and its department is known for being conservative in this way too. And so it was very, one of those things where I knew if I said it that way, rather than just being like, oh, this is something I care about and I'm passionate about, and, like, probably in some ways Hillary Clinton losing made it easier for people to not ask that question of, like, is this why Robyn's doing it? Even though, I feel like my friends knew and my students knew, but I never, like, that was very intentional. I never said it publicly, and then I wrote it as that's not true. I said it publicly once in 2019, early 2020, at a meeting in Cambridge, because in, like, a community meeting that I was at for work to, like, share resources with other nonprofits, because Cambridge has a really terrible anti-abortion crisis pregnancy center, which is another thing most folks won't know.
They're fake,
so there are
right? Like, they're misleading.
They're misleading, but so one of the pieces I'm working on that I owe my editor, sorry Fee, is
that's the second time you said that, Robyn.
Hey man, I'm, like, happy
Your poor
to
editors.
It's because of it's just been so bad, Jessa. I, like, feel terrible. Like, I've hit this, like, weird, I'm trying to learn to be a real person again with my ADHD diagnosis, and then stuff keeps happening, and I'm like, no, I can't write this week because I need to do this.
Threw a wrench in your week, right? Like,
well, or more like the Ontario election. I would say that is more than anything. It's okay. So I was on a very good campaign, and I think that that's, in terms of something to make you feel good, silver lining. Cambridge fucking showed up. We did not win. We should have.
Marjorie Knight.
Marjorie Knight, I was with her every single day that I could be. I would have been there more if the SCOTUS stuff hadn't happened the day the election started, and that was really fun. That was why that day was so hard, because I was like, oh, cool. So I'm about to watch what I am seeing as the most despondent election in Ontario history, and it's going to feel terrible, because in 2018, when Ford won, I felt pretty good. I helped elect Terence Kernahan in London North Centre for the first time. I was one of the there was 4 grad students. We canvassed our butts off 12 hours a day. I will not ever be able to do that again. But winning that seat and taking down Kate Graham was because of how I feel about white feminists and fake feminists in this space, was one of the best months of my life, even though I was exhausted and probably have mental health problems. That's an issue. But anyways, Marjorie's campaign was different. I know how hard that election was for everyone. I don't think anyone had a good time. But Marjorie, myself, Jose, who is the new Southwest rep on provincial council, and Alison Blagden, who used to be one of Suze's staffers. Anyways, it was just a very actually healthy campaign, which was nice. I went to work on that campaign specifically and intentionally. I had my choice of campaigns in Waterloo Region, and Cambridge is where I work, but also Marjorie's a friend of mine, and she is the real deal. She still makes $41,000 a year, and like me, she is doing way too much work for way too many people, and has had tons of health issues because of that, but she just keeps going. And so I am devastated forever that she is not my MPP, and I don't know if she'll be able to run again, just because, you know this, you run twice. It's hard. You put your heart and soul into it, and it feels really hard when it doesn't come through, especially when the other side doesn't campaign at all. And the other thing is, we were genuinely campaigning against Belinda from the New Blue Party. And so for me, that was really important in terms of my broader work around reproductive justice and these things, because that is fascism. They had car flags with the New Blue logo on that they were driving around all day while doing Get Out the Vote. And I was like, oh, that's a little Nazi-like, don't you think? So yeah, that's a motivator. That for me is more of why I'm having a hard time writing, just because I'm really mad and upset still, and I don't know when that's gonna go away. And it's set everyone, it's friends of mine, my friends, I've been having fights with friends I shouldn't be, it's really hard. And I know it's yeah, I in sort of as a good transition here, that's to give folks silver lining. Part of what I've been doing around my reproductive justice work for the last couple years is, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, Loretta Ross, who created and was the first director of Sister Song nationally in the US, has now moved into some new theory stuff. She is proof that you can drop out of a PhD and get a tenure track job at 60, which I hope to do one day, maybe. Sincerely, that happened to her. I was like, oh my God, what? Loretta dropped out of a PhD too? So that she always makes me feel better when I have a bad day. But she has been writing this stuff because she's seen, particularly on the left, and I think the fight in 2016, the long fight of the Bernie bros versus the Clinton people, and the continuation and kind of the polarization of those two groups, which I personally don't even know where to feel or sit in, because it's weird, right? I know now I'm in Bernie, but at the time I felt this way, and it's there's just so many emotions, you know what I mean? Flying around.
We're so problematic this way. I'm sure the right sits there and listens to this, is what is wrong with them?
And so that's what Loretta, and it's not just Loretta, she would say, she didn't come up with this concept, but basically her and a bunch of organizers have been seeing all this, And they've been doing this work forever. And so basically they were like, we need to do something because the polarization is actually the biggest problem, and the ways in which, like, we can't even have a conversation with each other. We can't, like, work together. And it's like we're fighting with the people who we agree with 90% of everything on, rather than fighting the people who maybe agree with us on 50, and we need to get them to 70 so that we can get that new housing development built, because if not, it's not going to happen. She has created essentially the concept. It's her and Lone Tran who are the lead educators. It's called Calling In the Call Out Culture. And so basically she, like, actually I think the last one is tonight. I'm missing it right now. Oh, great. Or like 3 hours earlier. But it's essentially, she offers these online courses. They're $20, and they're going to do them for as long as it takes to teach people how to have hard conversations with each other again through social justice language. And she essentially, her, like, Lone talked about this in, like, some blog post, and essentially she's created a whole framework with them, and then they do, like, Zoom workshops where, like, you're put into a breakout group and you have to, like, have hard conversations. And so those spaces I've been attending, like, I attended because it's $20, so, like, anytime she runs it, I just sign up, and then I go as many times as I can, and I'll keep going. And she's done a couple, they did, like, more, like, discussion spaces in the winter because they didn't have the capacity to teach the full course. So there was, like, a week where, like, literally, like, every left-wing organizer that I admire across North America was talking about, like, perfectionism in our movements and how we deal with that, and, like, the feelings that we feel. And so just, like, that's definitely where my brain is headed in terms of this work, because, like, reproductive justice is the goal. That's the framework. But what we've been missing, I think, in terms of, is the how in some ways. And not that, like, Black women and Indigenous, like what people of color have been showing us, marginalized folks, like there is organizing happening, but it's not happening together in the way that, say, the 1970 abortion caravan was a national movement where women drove from Vancouver to Ottawa, but what people don't know is every single place along the way they had people to stay with, they had meetings, they talked about abortion, they had a coffin they drove around with. They literally went everywhere. And my favorite part of the book on this, which Karen Wells published in 2020, and that was part of the project we were working with her a little bit, is that as someone from BC who has many feelings about Toronto and people from Toronto, Jessa, I know you're from Scarborough originally, but, like, Toronto, the beast, is, like, the fights that the feminists from out west had in Toronto were, like, unlike anything that they had in any of the other stops. They got along in Regina, they got along here, but they get to Toronto and, like, all the Toronto women are like, well, you're not doing this thing right, and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, wow, classic. And so, like, how do we, like...
No wonder everyone hates us.
But, like, how do we, like, get past that, right? And so basically this framework that they've come up with, that they're now building, like, more, like, somatic, like, learning how to even regulate your own emotions as a part of social justice work, because I know, like,
folks like us need that, man, desperately.
Right? We need to know these things.
The left in general, I think, is full of neurodivergent people that obviously, sometimes struggle with emotional regulation. But I'm fascinated by this, work on the polarization of the left. I mean, it wasn't on the agenda when when I think of reproductive justice. Once you give me the 3 tenets, though, it became clear that it was very all-encompassing. And it surprises me that, with all the intersectional approaches that most people have, that work isn't being done together, that there is still that gap. Because, I took poli-sci, I learned about the different waves of feminism and the problems that lay within. And, I think it was always kind of taught to the point where we were getting better, like where we were starting to center marginalized voices and work alongside and understand our know our lane, so to speak. And are you kind of feeling that's not quite the case yet, especially when we're talking about reproductive justice?
Yeah. So my thought on that, and this is very much even bigger picture and like more meta than you would even expect, is that I think that the way that we teach those things is so Eurocentric, so corporate, so like the neoliberal agenda starts around the time that women's studies departments get more funding. Like women's studies really, like a couple people get hired in the 60s and 70s, but it's like the 80s and 90s in Canada where we're seeing like the hiring that we are seeing now around Indigenous issues at universities was happening for women's studies and gender studies. And so I think that, and this is like historians are guilty of this, but when other disciplines teach history, historians always get angry because it's a joke in history that political scientists think they're historians, but they actually have no idea how to do it because they literally don't look past like 5 years. And it's like, but they then steal our students by being like, but we'll give you a 90 if you come here. Actual things that are said at Western by the political science department to history prospective students. So it's things that have been said to me by students. Why am I getting a 90 in poli sci?
Between our regional, I'm a York University grad.
York is a good school. York is very, by that I mean like
you don't hate my school.
I love your school very much.
Just my city and my major.
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Which is fine. That's okay. We're allowed to. We can have disagreements.
We can bond on other things, Robyn.
Exactly. And York is actually, I had a very lovely summer at York while the last transit line there was being constructed in 2017.
Well, that's about a 7-year span. That could have been any time.
Yeah, but it was right when I was about to open researching at the Ontario Archives because I lived there in a tiny. I lived in the basement of a. Well, there you go. I was every day. There were awesome decolonized posters, like on the other side, because I was like, the Starbucks was, I had to like walk around a bunch of construction to get my coffee. And yeah, by the like film department, there was some really cool like decolonized stuff. And I was like, oh my God, because like Western has a picture of like the governor of the Bank of Canada on the side of our faculty building in a giant creepy, like he's looking at you way. Or Cameron Bailey from TIFF. He's on the side of the alumni building. The greatness starts here at Western.
Oh no.
Western's really good at branding. That's why do you think our education system is the way it is right now? Stephen Lecce learned everything he needed to know in his 4 years getting a poli-sci degree at Western. Jessa?
Oh my gosh. Wait, we kind of went on a tangent and talked about your experience with the NDP. So I'm going to use that to transition into something I told you I was going to ask you to talk about. Is you made a statement, and I'm not arguing with you by any means, but I wanted to expand on it, that even though you talk about the law, you've studied, its history, and you engage in electoral politics, you feel like law and politics are not our friends. You put that on Twitter the other day. I totally get that between the Supreme Court and the loss in Cambridge and just generally in Ontario, but more deeply, what do you mean by that? Yeah.
For sure. Well, and that's actually always been true of our movement. So the 1970 abortion caravan, they were not allowed to go into parliament. They literally had to sneak their way in, and they chained themselves to the parliament. And I still, like, the fact that people don't name drop that in left-wing spaces all the time is devastating.
Like, I don't know enough about it. I'm definitely needing to go on YouTube.
Well, so you need to go on a deep dive into the abortion caravan, because the best part of my pandemic first wave was working with the women from the caravan, who one of them is a social work prof at UMBC in Northern BC. Like, all of these women who were on the caravan grew up to be like the cool leftists that like we all all want to grow up to be, which is awesome. And I've become friends with them. So like Ellen Woodsworth was the first openly gay, I think, city councilor in Vancouver. Like, so when you do a deep dive into these people, it's like, holy crap, like there are like 60s and 70s like feminists, and they would be like, no, we're not. Like they genuinely would tell you
not the
like
F
that
word.
I'm not. Yeah. But essentially, like that moment, Pierre-Louis Trudeau like ran away from them. He literally, like, one of my favorite CBC documentaries is on the abortion caravan, like CBC Radio. And there's a clip of him saying, because this is after he's passed the 1969 omnibus bill to make abortion legal, but only under advisement of 3 doctors, if you stand in front of them and say,
some people can't find an appointment with one.
This was basically hospitals in Canada in the 70s were allowed to set up abortion clinics, and that was essentially, the law was protecting the doctors. It was not protecting pregnant people. It was about, can we make it so that this is available sometimes when doctors feel it's allowed? And so like part of Dr. Easterbrook's actually a part of a legacy in London where they essentially ignored that and just like, it was a formality, i.e. the doctor who was the abortion provider had friends who were also doctors who knew what he was doing and just signed off on all the forms. In other settings, it actually was, you had to stand in front of a committee and beg your case and explain why, like, your mental health would be bad if you had a baby, and why is this and why is that, and like you're too young and all this stuff, and hope that they would say yes. And that's only if the hospital had set it up. PEI, as you already identified, didn't have a clinic until 2017, and that is because white women in PEI organized on the island in the 80s after this bill was passed to get their therapeutic abortion committee taken away. So they basically filled hospital boards. They would fill those meetings. This is all tracked in a book called No Choice by Kate McKenna, who is a CBC journalist. And it's really good. And it looks at how even for the first female premier of PEI, Catherine Colbeck, who's a conservative, was actually one of the women on the hospital board who was the deciding vote to get rid of this. So her claim to fame before she became premier was that, like, she had organized to remove abortion access from the island of PEI. So that's when I say those things. And I think particularly in recent years, I've become extremely frustrated with the Liberal Party of Canada and Justin Trudeau fundraising off of our work this way. Like, they do the same thing the Democrats do. Every single friggin' election, they brought up abortion. I was the first one to talk about Andrew Scheer and his problematic views in a, like, actual setting of, like, journalistic, like I published a piece in Ricochet in 2018 that connected him to Sam Oosterhoff and looked at the anti-abortion movement and the ways in which they were organizing through party apparatuses in order to try and basically get enough people in who held their views. The same way that, like, we would organize for, like, someone to be the, I don't know, nominee of this race and hope that happened, right? Like, and they've had the same frustrations in terms of, like, that came out with the Michelle Rempel piece to make that connection for folks. The, like, complaint, like, her releasing why she wasn't running for the United Conservative Party leader last week. I hate Michelle Rempel so much, but I actually hardcore respected that thing she wrote, in that, like, she wrote about all of the bullshit that happens in our political parties that cause it so that, like, change doesn't happen, because someone like her would be spending too much time fighting with the anti-abortion movement, who we can't piss off because, well, we need them, because if they aren't there, then Doug Ford doesn't have his 3 more votes that he needs to destroy everything, even though he's not actually anti-abortion, he's just an opportunist, right? Like, and so the Liberals love federally to pull out the boogeyman. They've done it both of the last elections. I was helping Bisan Zubi during the 2021 election, running in the one riding where a Liberal MP was forced to resign because of sexual assault allegations, and now Mike Morris is our MP for the only Palestinian candidate in Canada, and, like, being like, excuse me, like, how the heck is the conversation being dominated locally when I'm at the door by, like, abortion, and these people don't even know what they're talking about? Like, it's just, like it's baffling to me how little is often done and has been done since the early 90s when the Ontario NDP under Bob Rae set up the first abortion clinics. And I think that's also something that folks need to know in terms of things that make me proud to be a part of our party in various ways, because even though, like, I also don't like Bob Rae in any way, as in I joke.
He haunts
I'm
us
going to make
in
this joke
Ontario
on,
forevermore.
this joke needs to be on this podcast, so I'm going to say it. I have been making this joke to everyone I know that I really need him and Thomas Mulcair to be on, like, a Big Brother style show together that, like, we all get to watch until we, like, feel okay about the feelings you just said of, like, the haunting of both of them. And so, like, they just, like, no TV, no nothing. They're on slop, like, just for my entertainment.
Will they
and
bond?
That's, like, I think so. I think they have to, right? Like, I don't know,
Will
though.
we
This
warm
is an
up to them or
experiment.
hate them more?
I don't know.
I don't know
That's
either.
I feel like I just think it would feel really good if they didn't have access to social media and like couldn't like touch the outside. Like, let's just put them in that box for every election until, like, because, like, I don't need to hear what they think or their hot takes anymore. You've had enough power. Like, I don't understand. Like, can you please just anyways, yeah, that's and so I see there's a lot of really good work that is done right after the Morgenthaler case, led by Dr. Morgenthaler and various colleagues of his. Dr. Scott, who the Scott Clinic was a clinic that used to exist in the GTA but was forced to close because Dr. Scott retired. And the ways that abortion clinic laws work in Ontario is that they are done through the Ministry of Health, the same as as long-term care homes. And so if you lose that site license, you lose that site forever. And so it's very much something where, to sort of fast forward, we have not seen an expansion of abortion access in Ontario specifically in terms of, like, creating new abortion clinics. Not new, like, there are new providers being trained, and I think there are hospitals that have added abortion care to their rosters, but they're not being public about it because of how anti-abortion those communities are. I'm thinking about places like Sudbury and Sault Ste. Marie, where I've heard there are abortions being done sometimes and doctors will fly in, but it's not like 100% guarantee, and it depends on the limit and all these things. Like, so anyways, but the thing that happens in the early 90s, well, it's two things that are reproductive justice related. Midwifery is brought into the, like, medical system once again as a thing. It becomes, like, the Ontario midwives are set up under the Ontario NDP, and that's a really big deal. And there is, like, in terms of things, what could we organize around, what things would I like to see, there is a thing that the Ministry of Health can do that they do already still and has still happened under Ford, just not very much because of all the cuts, where midwives can get essentially licenses through the Ministry of Health to do things like IUD insertions and mifegammiso, which is the abortion pill. And so midwives in other countries do a lot of other reproductive health related things
And
that
this would be
you
to
don't need
increase
an OB
access,
to do.
right? Like,
It would increase access, and also I believe midwives offer better care because midwifery is very much grounded in reproductive justice type principles. It doesn't mean they always act that way. Obviously, individual practitioners are individual practitioners, but consent is very much as part of what you learn in midwife school versus what you learn in the medical system, and the ways that like OBs and gynecologists are very much a part of the legacy of colonization and white supremacy. And a lot of modern OB work was practiced on Black women's bodies and enslaved in the United States and in around the Civil War. And so, like, that's a difference, whereas midwifery has always been there. It's women who have been catching babies because women have always caught our own babies, and that is like that's part of why the Indigenous reclaiming a midwifery is so important. But you can see how that would improve access if, like, say, I don't know, we made it so that every single midwife, no matter what, could dispense mifegai-miso, because it's not something that like a family doctor can do it. A family doctor can do medication abortion. That is something that the National Abortion Federation of Canada has been working aggressively on in terms of improving access in recent years.
I don't think a lot of people know that.
Yeah, so they're educating a lot of family doctors in terms of, because the family doctors themselves don't know that, because if you haven't kept up with that one part of your education, why would you, right? And that should be required, but it's not. And so midwives are where it's like, okay, like I personally, the last time I had my IUD inserted, I went to Crown Point Midwives in Hamilton, because I didn't want an OB to do it, because I'd had so many terrible experiences with various OBs over the years, because of what I now know is the combination of hemochromatosis, which is a thing that causes my blood to hold too much iron, and ADHD, which there's not a lot of research on our bodies and the way we respond to pain, but that is a thing that I have personally experienced. And so I wanted the very best, and I know a midwife is the very best, because they are never going to hurt me unnecessarily, because it is all about me and my comfort, and they're going to explain everything. And my best friend, Brenda Dong, is a midwife. She is lovely. She actually graduated during the pandemic, which was incredibly trying, as in she did her 4th year placement in 2020. So she had to learn to be a midwife in 4th year. As the pandemic was starting, her placement got pushed back. It got pushed around. It got this, it got that. And she did it all. And she's a practicing midwife in Cambridge today. But she would love nothing more than to be able to offer people like me a full spectrum of reproductive health services. And that is what people in the United States are organizing around. There is a clinic in Nashville, Tennessee called Choices, that is a birthing center and an abortion clinic. Because the problem is that we've separated these things out because of the patriarchy. It has nothing to do with what women and pregnant bodies and the ways in which like pregnancy has always happened. Because the story I told you earlier tonight is all about how these things were connected and then torn apart, right? And so like that's where like I've been pushing both behind the scenes and then also publicly always for midwives. And midwifery pay equity is a huge one, right? Like the fact that the Ford government continues to, and it wasn't just Ford, it was Kathleen Wynne too. The midwives have been winning pay equity cases at the Ontario Superior Court for at least 5 years now. If not longer, because they are underpaid. If you look at how much money OBs make compared to them, or even family doctors for the same thing, it's not okay. And it's built into the Ministry of Health because midwives, unlike doctors, can't bill OHIP. And so they get paid at the end for their course of care for the entire pregnancy. So that means they have to have relationships with different OBs, because if they need to transfer your care because you become high risk and they can't deal with it, because the one thing midwives can't do is a C-section or like really high risk pregnancies, they have to have that relationship where they don't get paid for the labor because the other thing is midwives will see you from 9 weeks into your pregnancy up until like, I think it's 6 months after birth. They do home visits. Like they're friggin'.
Yeah, you don't get that from your
like,
OB, right? You don't usually get to see them until you're much later in your pregnancy, unless you're high risk. And then you get one appointment unless there's complications. You get your 6 week.
Right, unless it's devastating. If you're seeing an OB that much early, something bad has happened. Like that's not, and that means like everyone's body's different. Like that's the other thing with pregnancy that I think folks listening, something I firmly believe that comes out of like part of my work is I developed the Empowering Pregnancy program at Shore Center in Kitchener, which is Shore basically has been trying to move in this direction in terms of offering that full spectrum of service. And so my other best friend, Ash Metzloff, is a outreach worker who supports low-income pregnant people in Kitchener. And that's a program, again, very low funded. We've had to fight to get funding for that in order to like provide access to things like beds for people who can't afford them or cell phones. Like people will always have everything for their baby ready, and then they won't have a single piece of clothing that fits them or a winter jacket. And like everyone's so focused on the health outcomes after the child is in this world. Like, this is going back to how much I hate the anti-abortion movement, that like there is no, like, it's amazing how, like, we could have a whole other episode about things I learned about pregnancy through developing that program that I thought I knew and didn't, even though I was already deep into this abortion work. Like, basically where I was like, holy crap, pregnancy is actually more stigmatized than this. I didn't even know, like, how stigmatized pregnancy is and how little you know and how much they assume you know and how little support there is. But for parenting, yeah. So it's just like, it's one of those things where like midwives, midwives are the people who do that. Like, if you can get a midwife, like, everyone I know for the most part has really good experiences with midwives just because of how their course of care is. Because you get the long appointments, they explain things to you, you're there every couple weeks. And so like, that is better outcomes. That's preventative care. And that's what could be happening around other reproductive health issues all under one roof. But instead, we've chosen to have a few hospitals here and there. And then, yeah, there are independent abortion providers in this province, but they were set up in the early 90s and no new ones have been added since. And so, and two of them, the Mississauga Women's Clinic and the Brampton Women's Clinic, both charge, I believe it's a $75 fee. Maybe it may have gone up because of the pandemic, because they're not fully funded through the Ministry of Health. And so in order to pay for that procedure happening outside of a hospital setting, that is what they charge their patients. And that's true, like, Canada-wide. Depending on which province you live in, it depends on whether or not they even have independent clinics. So like New Brunswick, you mentioned, they will not, like Clinic 554, I've been supporting Clinic 554 in Fredericton since I started doing this work. One of the first things I did was send money there multiple times because there was flooding in their clinic and they had to move rapidly because of the floods in New Brunswick. And so the province of New Brunswick was telling women to drive from Fredericton to Moncton on a road that was closed due to floods. Like, it's not just that, like, that is the rule. It's that, like, these things have real world consequences. I think about, like, I've done so much work supporting people from the county of Grey Bruce getting to London, Ontario for abortions. And every single person I know who's in the abortion, like, movement or, like, is a social worker in this in Southwestern Ontario, and there's not very many of us, they all have those same stories. Owen Sound and that surrounding area, like, there's tons of population there, but it's all spread out. It's super conservative, and because of the stigma around abortion. And then when the Greyhound bus, when the Greyhound left, my first fear was, wow, no one's going to be able to get abortions and they're all just going to keep their pregnancies now.
It's almost overwhelming, Robyn. Like, so when I pulled you on the show, obviously I'd asked you to come on before, but when Roe versus Wade was struck down, it became all about talking about abortion and access to abortion. But through this discussion, it's become so clear to me that reproductive justice in Canada is so much more all-encompassing than preventing conservatives coming to power to strike down any kind of, to maybe restrict funding. And it's so much more complicated than that, especially when you use the tenets of reproductive justice, the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and the right to raise a healthy child. So, I mean, the amount of work that needs to be done seems like a lot. I don't know where, you've shared so many great stories of folks that are doing the work and challenging the narrative, especially, and learning to center the important voices. But, and we're kind of drawing to the end of our time as well. So I wanted to give you time to talk about how the other work you do ties into this. I see you are starting an uncampaign school, because I think like a lot of what you talked about is unlearning. You say it's learning, but really it's unlearning. And a lot of folks understand what that means. It's like what we've been taught is not entirely accurate, and it's like a new type of knowledge. So uncampaign school kind of has that feel in its language. Is that the kind of idea behind it? Do you want to take some time and kind of tie that into this discussion?
Yeah, I would love to. And then I'll finish with kind of things that I think we should be working on in terms of the political realm of things, because I definitely have ideas, and I also want folks to watch this summer, particularly with the conservative leadership race, because even though like that's not the only, like, basically, in essence, if folks take anything away, I don't think that that should be the only thing we're doing. And I think that we can learn to walk and chew gum at the same time, which is what my friends in the reproductive justice movement in the U.S., the hosts of that Boom Lawyer podcast, say all the time, that Democrats say, well, we can't do this thing, so we're doing this thing, and why can't we do both? And so for me, like, obviously, I come at this as someone who, I moved to Ontario to hopefully teach at the post-secondary level, because I thought that was a possibility in 2012 based on things versus British Columbia, because I was in BC under the Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark administrations in my youth, so job opportunities here weren't exactly great for the humanities, and so for me, I consider myself an educator first, and I think sometimes I come across as more aggressive online, especially on Twitter, than I am in real life, because I really believe that most people are pro-choice. But I also think that we need to, unlearn, honestly, for me, unlearn what we've been taught about politics and political engagement in Canada, because I think that a lot of us, like, I was born in 1989, so I joke all the time that I've never lived in a Canada where abortion was illegal, because it's true, I haven't. And that's a beautiful thing.
And let's hope it stays that way.
I think it will, and I sincerely, because of the movement that organizers from all walks of life, and that's the other, like doing that abortion caravan project really just grounded me in the work that had been done to make that happen, because it didn't feel obvious anymore. It didn't feel like I think that sometimes we learn about those history moments because of the narrative of progress, and it's like, of course this thing would happen, but like, no, like there was a multi-generational, multi-class, multi-ethnic, multi-racial movement in Canada from the 60s to 1988 that was working on abortion as a part of the broader women's liberation movement. And they really saw that as a piece of the puzzle. And so I feel like a lot of that work and grassroots organizing has been lost. And particularly, I've been frustrated in Canada at how we haven't really had our Bernie Sanders moment yet, in terms of like having like just masses of young people volunteering. Like, I know it's happened a little bit, but our spaces are just really hard to get into, and not, like, I find a lot of, in my experience, the leaders for like boards and like, I'm not talking about folks who are making, like, I like people on boards, nonprofit boards, whether it's like even writing associations, like the kind of different perspectives that come there. Sometimes it can be really great, and sometimes I'm like, whoa, like, how are we not prioritizing these same things here in terms of like, we are saying we have these same values. So if I sat down with this person, like, I'm pretty sure that we would agree on most things. And so something's happening that's causing us to not be able to then make change or show up for each other. And like, we have to stop doing that. Like, it's just, like, I've seen, particularly in London, London has an amazing labor movement, and we've worked really hard to kind of build different groups together. And it's not perfect, but there's definitely a lot more action. If you look at what the Muslim youth did after the Our London family stuff, like, obviously that was them, but that was in relationship to things like the Black Lives Matter organizing that was happening in London, like the organizing that my friend Jody was doing with the DSC. Like there's just a really good labor council in London, and they're problematic in some ways. They're still very white, but like there's stuff happening, and there's groups that are trying to work together, even if like we don't always agree on everything. And like, And I think that that's where, like, that disagreement, the ability to have conflicts and be able to talk about things, we aren't doing that anymore in a way that's healthy. And it's hurt me too. Like, I've had some really hard conversations with folks over the last couple years where I've had to step back from work that I wanted to keep doing, because I just didn't see, like, the amount of effort I was putting into it being reciprocated. And that's not healthy for me either, right? Like, that's, now that I've been exploring my ADHD and stuff, like it really has to be Loretta Ross, in talking about reproductive justice and talking about her calling in stuff, talks about movement work as like geese flying, and how like one person always leads, but then there's geese at the back, and if two of those geese, if someone's sick, two of those geese come down with them, and then like we rotate who's at the front of the V, and that's the only way we're going to get there. And so that, with all of that in mind, and just seeing, to be honest, like, I was prompted by International Women's Day this year, and just feeling very much like women-only spaces aren't doing these things, and it's very much becoming like a branding thing for like certain women to get ahead, and the lean-in style feminism and stuff. Like, I just don't like it, and I know that but I also still believe optimistically in the good of the community and the good of people, because I see it every day at my work in nonprofit life, and even just like the people I meet in spaces and then work with things on. And so the Uncampaign School, which like I've been taking I made the website, it's up there. We're going to be actually running it the weekend of October 1st and 2nd. I'm hoping to have it be very hybrid so that lots of people can come, even if you aren't in the cities we're going to do like actions in. Like, I'm trying to figure it out, and so we'll see. Like, it could go terribly, and that's what I think is part of what I'm trying to learn.
All
and
organizing,
right, but that's right. That's what it is. Like, I want to teach people that. I want to teach people that it's okay to fail, and that it's okay to try new things, but that it has to be fun, and it has to be like we have to prioritize making sure that the people who are showing up, in particular the volunteers, are having a good time. Because that's actually what the other side is doing. Like I will say, the anti-abortion movement,
of Ottawa.
Right? Like sincerely, like, no, they actually are. And so, or like the PPC had a rally at my former favorite strawberry farm in London during the last election, which was devastating because I can never go back there. I found a new one. It's okay, everyone. Hoffman's in North Waterloo. If anyone has any information about fascism at Hoffman's, please come into my DMs, because I'll be very upset. But they are not fascist. Miller Berries in London, do not go there. Go to Heman's. They're better. Heman's is the non-fascist one, but anyways, and so my hope is that with all the friends that I've gathered over the last couple of years, and my academic background and my work in the nonprofit sector, I've got a couple people that I've been talking to in terms of figuring out what the structure of this is going to look like, but very much applying that reproductive justice based lens to even just the structure of how we're going to organize it. So, I'm hoping to be off just for the next week or so to rest a little bit after Roe falling. And in some ways I'm glad that was released, just so that, like, oh my God, now I don't have to guess what's next, right? Like the election being over is also, like, I have a lot of grief around it, but it's also like, okay, those were 4 years where I fought really hard, and now it's time to reassess and try and figure out, because that fight was really hard, but it also killed me in a lot of ways. And so, like, I need to figure out what that balance is better, because this is going to be a lot longer fight than just stopping Doug Ford from getting reelected, which was my, like, short-term goal. And so, because I realized that we need people in spaces that are our allies, and we need to build those relationships, because if we don't have those relationships where we can center our like people, humans, and what our communities need, and thinking through and sharing our different experiences, that's how stuff like the convoy happens. Like, that's why they're there, and that's why I'm glad you brought that up. I've been thinking, horrified. There was some poll that came out when that was happening in January, about how, like, 70% of Canadians didn't oppose it or something. Like, it wasn't that they were, like, pro-convoy, but it was just that, like, they understood why they were upset. And I understand, too, because our government has failed us incessantly over and over again at all levels.
Yeah,
it
not
doesn't
just
matter.
COVID.
Like, to be clear, like, London right now, there's this huge fight happening that I've been watching on social media where Safe Space London, which is, to give a shout out to one of the organizations I look to in terms of, like, what this type of structure would look like that I'm talking about. Safe Space London is a sex worker collective that managed several years ago to get a space, and they've been offering street outreach out of there since then to anyone. Like, it's not just for sex workers because they're actually awesome. But essentially what's happening is apparently they're being attacked by people in downtown London who are saying, like, homeless or evil and all this. And so, like, there's been, like, actual harassment happening there. And London City Council is doing nothing. Like they are being harassed in the city by other people. And it's just, and the homelessness rates are skyrocketing because the housing crisis has been trickling down the 401. I've seen it. I moved from London to Kitchener, and I have friends who've lived in Toronto. I've had enough conversations with various grad students in different communities over the last 10 years. That's the way it's happening. It's trickling down, and so Kitchener hit its peak, and now it's London, and because we go a little further, right? And so, it's going to be about building what I wish I had when I was an undergrad, what I wish I had in terms, because you talk about, like, learning the different ways of feminism. I took first year women's studies, and I friggin' hated that class. I want to be clear. I thought it was a joke. I was like, why do we need feminism? I'm from Kelowna. Like, women are equal here, right? But, like, it's genuinely, like, that's what we've grown up telling and being told by our moms. Like, our mothers, I believe, and this is something I think about often, like, kind of what happened to women in Canada. But I believe very strongly after reading Judy Rebick, who was the voice of the Morgenthaler movement and saved him from garden shears in the 80s, reading her memoir, Heroes in My Head, that the Montreal Massacre created such an intense fear amongst feminists like Judy and shame and guilt because they felt that they were responsible for those women's death. That is why the boldness that we saw at the end of the 80s went away. And then we saw Women in Gender Equity Canada become the main space that these things were done. I believe that those leaders from our leaders who are still here, but the ones that all the women I've name drop are people who were leaders in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I haven't been talking about people like Canada's Hillary Clinton, one and only Chrystia Freeland, who I'm supposed to feel is powerful and amazing in her role. Like, that's what I'm supposed to feel as, that's feminism, right?
Please, God, no.
But that's what we're being told, right?
Yeah.
I just, like, I see that the women who became leaders after the massacre and basically grew up in the 90s and then got law degrees and were essentially believed that things were, like, that it was done. Like, abortion was legal, like, the women's rights movement was over. In my life, those white women have been the biggest bullies and are often the ones who tell me I'm being too much or too aggressive or that I should just sit down and shut up. And so I don't think that the answer is getting mad at them anymore because it's not working. Like I just said, calling them out is not working, and I'm trying really hard to stop doing that because I worry about it harming the relationships I do care about. But saying that, I think that we need a space to have these conversations, and it needs to be done in a way where, like, people are there learning the same way that I have been online. And so it's that sort of connecting those two things, like all of these pieces of who I am together, but also then bringing really cool folks in. And yeah, I think that Zoom will allow us to do that, where I could have, like, a speaker from BC who is from the abortion caravan come. But I also want it to be action, because that's the thing that I feel is often missing. Like, I know I've heard you say this too about convention and the ways that it becomes a giant fundraiser for the party. And that's fine. If that's what convention is, tell us. Then I'm going to, and that's basically, like, for me, I need to create something new, because I need convention to not be me just livid about everything that's going on. I need it to just be like what it is. You know what I mean? Like I think I'm done expecting more from existing spaces, and that goes for Western too. Like, academics are just as culpable, myself included. Like, I had to get out of the academy and into the community before I really understood how to do this stuff. And even in nonprofit, like, I could be guilty of this, and because I don't do frontline work for my nonprofit. I have the privilege of getting to do communications for them, and I work really hard to make sure that whatever I'm saying reflects the staff, the community, all of it, and people whose voices aren't at the table. And that's extra labor that most people don't do. But that's what we need to teach people how to do that. We need to teach people those critical thinking skills again, and not just like, here are the waves of feminism, or here's what happened in the 60s when this thing was being organized, or, 10 years ago we were doing this thing at the G20. Like, great, that's all awesome. None of that is action. Like, the number of book clubs I've seen pop up and just various things, it's very much like, and that was my biggest frustration with the Ontario election, was the lack of people showing up to volunteer when we needed them. And I mean general people, like, not, I have like various things, but just, yeah, we, like, people who are just normal people in my community who say how much they care about the schools and this and that, but then won't come and do one canvas for me. Like that's who I'm talking about. And I believe that this school could help that in a way that's, like, I really want it to be kind and caring, and like, as much as I can get animated in those things, like, one of the panels I'm talking to some of my former co-organizers in London who, like, did all that work with me around Western, is like us doing a panel where we talk about, like, what it means to, like, work against whiteness in feminism and how you do that, because that is a really friggin' hard thing, and talking about it in a way where we're not perfect. Like, because I often think that I go to political spaces and people don't talk about their mistakes, and they don't talk about the hard stuff and the disagreements, and then it feels fake, because we're all humans. We all have disagreements. Things happen, there's conflict, and covering up that conflict, whether it's colonization and white supremacy, or just like someone being an asshole in a left-wing space, is what is killing us.
I think that's particularly true in partisan politics, like keeping everything under wraps, especially genuine disagreements, which, like you say, are needed to kind of get to an end. Those tough discussions need to happen.
But it's normal. We have to have discussions, and the discussions have to be a process.
Yes, but partisan politics has become a marketing ploy, right? And it's not healthy to look like we're arguing amongst ourselves, especially. I disagree, right? Like, I think it would demonstrate a healthy democracy within something people would be drawn to. But, let's pull it back to reproductive justice just briefly, because we have, run quite long, and just leave us with some kind of, think of your average listener that, definitely does not see themselves yet as an educator, right? Can't insert themselves there. Maybe they heard the OFL's call to action. They've gone to a rally. This is the first time they've ever really been concerned about reproductive rights, their reproductive rights, or in general. Think of what you could kind of tell them that where they could be spending their energy or focusing on.
Yeah. Well, so definitely look at what different organizations in your community related to. It doesn't just have to be reproductive rights, because, like I said, there are so few places in Canada, and honestly so few people who get paid to do this work in Canada, which is a whole other conversation in terms of, like, the apparatuses of organizing that exist in the US on this issue. Like, wow, I would have a very nice, cushy job at this point if I lived there, I really believe, because we just don't pay people to do this stuff. And so a lot of the work is done by community nonprofits, but it's sometimes not, because just because you don't have a Planned Parenthood type organization in your community does not mean that someone's not doing this work, because everyone everywhere needs to access abortion. And so I would try and learn what does abortion services look like where you live. And the place you would go to do that, that's the easiest, is choiceconnect.ca. That's the project I mentioned earlier. It is a online app where basically you can put in your city and it will tell you the closest abortion provider to you anywhere in the country. And so from there, and it'll also tell you the distance, which is kind of cool. And you can look at different ones and put in different cities. So feel free. Part of why we created that was to give folks that access in terms of that information, because that's often what makes it difficult is hospitals keep it secret. This doctor keeps it secret. And you often don't know if your family doctor is pro-choice. So that's actually something that you also can do is if you have a family doctor, and I know a lot of millennials and Gen Z do not, but if you are lucky enough to have a doctor, talking to them about abortion. I used to do that genuinely when I first started doing this work in London, because the abortion pill had just been legalized in Canada in 2015. I would go into my family doctor to talk about my anxiety and anxiety meds and various issues. And I would be like, so are you doing this yet? And then she'd be like, okay, back to your issues. And I'd be like, I know, but this is like really important. And so just like asking, like, have you even heard of this? Because if patients aren't asking them about it, which is oftentimes with stigma, they won't, because they're worried the person's going to in small towns, tell the family member or what have you. Like if you're there and it's not about you, that gives you the opportunity to have that conversation and like not make it awkward, hopefully, because you have some kind of relationship with your doctor.
Don't
like for
wait
me,
until you need the abortion pill or you need the services,
Yes.
right? Have this discussion to start opening the minds of your, especially small town doctors, so to speak.
Yeah.
When you're in that safe
doctors,
space, right? Like of not being
exactly.
exposed.
And when it's and also being like, I care about this for my friends and neighbors, right? Like that you like understand that this is important and that this is something that they can do to help improve access and educate. Like ask them, what do they do for unplanned pregnancies? Like how much do they know? The same is true of ultrasound techs. One of the things that happens often that's really hard in the work that my friends at Shore Center do, like the social workers there, is they will do everything to give people the most inclusive, beautiful abortion experience. They're fucking all-stars. Like no one does a better patient experience in Canada than Shore Center around this issue. It's them and the Willow Women's Clinic in Vancouver. The level of just patient-centered care, it's because that's they're run by people who are not, like, it's just a different structure. Like, Shore is a social worker-led clinic with family doctors that work with them. And so the social worker is the one who is making the decisions about policies ultimately in consultation with others. And that means that they do more in terms of trans inclusion, like all these things. We will send folks to ultrasound techs who will then say things that are anti-choice to people. Because oftentimes you have to have an ultrasound to determine. We did manage right before the pandemic to get that requirement taken off for the abortion pill, i.e. it was just a suggestion for an ultrasound rather than a requirement, in terms of like, if you can't get access to an ultrasound in your community, like that's also an issue. But understanding that like anti-abortion stigma can show up anywhere, and just like signaling to people that you're pro-choice. Like I dream of a world where at universities, like that's a part of their training for all like softs when they're like in the dorms and stuff. Like I just really think that like normalizing it and just seeing it as like any other procedure, that's what activists have been saying for a very long time on this issue. And then I would say the other thing, and this is really bringing that reproductive justice bent to it, is when I was working on the 2020 Abortion Caravan Project, I got a chance to talk to Manitoba MLA Nahani Fontaine, who does not get the credit she deserves on this, but has been working on this issue forever. She's in the NDP in Manitoba. She has had her bill to pass a bubble zone law in Manitoba blocked by what was the Pallister government several times. So that's an issue that we could organize around right now in terms of helping push and put political pressure on those sorts of things. And Nahani, in talking to me, because she was helping me with the in the 2020 Abortion Caravan Project, there's a paper. So there's 10 issue papers in there with a bunch of calls to action for folks. So if you actually like let's say you're interested in trans-inclusive abortion services, that is one of the papers, and it talks about what needs to happen in order to make that better in all of Canada. But the decolonized healthcare piece, which I was one of the main authors on, because we were just like Indigenous activists are at such high capacity that I was working with several people to try and kind of bring it together who were being very kind and donating their time to me in the first wave of the pandemic for this. We need to make it so that Indigenous women have the ability to make this decision themselves in their home communities. Pregnancy, if you live on reserve or in Northern Canada, is a very dangerous thing still. It is something where, like, we need more midwives. We need to allow Indigenous women to, like, train their own midwives and, like, build that capacity. But more than that, Nahani was talking to me about how because on reserve, often it's a nursing station that's delivering the medicine, there is no abortion because nurses aren't allowed to dispense the abortion pill. And so that's something that, like, the government of Canada federally could do something about right now, because healthcare on reserve is not administered the same way as healthcare at the provincial level. And so, yeah, there are very specific asks in those issue papers, like so many. I am so proud of that project because of it is action-based. Like, it tells the history of each of the 10 pieces was themes that were identified by members of our movement, past and present, as like what the movement needed. What would the abortion caravan have looked like in 2020? Like the 1970 abortion caravan, they drive a coffin across Canada and say, women are dying, we need abortion, because of that therapeutic abortion law being so inaccessible to poor women, to rural women, to people who don't have friends at the hospital in this one setting or that one setting, right? And so what would that look like in 2020? Well, that was what that project was about. It was telling that history, telling that story, but also saying, hey, these are the things we need to do. And I haven't seen people take up all of that. Like I gave the movement a blueprint, the country a blueprint, and it's there. It's like there are action items. There are things that we need to be doing. I think about, like I already mentioned, convention. Like one of the things I would love to see one day, which should be an easy thing to pass, though, like friggin', there was an anti-abortion politician, like Matthew Green in Hamilton Centre replaced the last anti-abortion politician in the federal NDP in 2019. So this is not a distant past, and so we can say we're pro-choice all we want, and I actually do want to give Jagmeet credit here, because the federal party has been doing more of what we've asked than ever before under his leadership. There has never been a federal NDP leader who has done more stuff around abortion rights work in terms of holding Justin Trudeau accountable on some of these things, but it's not enough. And like, we actually, like when I say that, like, it's just like, he's like, we need to do more. And it's like, no, we need to have an action plan, which is, again, what we, like, all of us on the left have been saying about the NDP is like, we can say, we can criticize, but like, we also need to be like, no, what would this actually look like? What would national, like making sure that every province has enough midwives look like? Because that's honestly, I joke all the time. Give the midwives control of the entire healthcare system for like 3 to 5 years. Put them in charge, because all of their stuff is so, like, they are the queens of patient-centered care. And I adore them so much. Like, I would love to do communications for midwives one day, because I just think that they are the heroes of our healthcare system, because they do all of these things with low intervention, and they actually listen to you. They try. How
refreshing.
They try their best.
Yeah.
So, right? It's so weird. And imagine if everyone else had to follow those rules.
Yeah, in the same way you talked about the social workers structuring that one particular clinic, we'll have midwives rewrite the Canada Health Act, and all our
That's all I
problems
want.
will be solved. Robyn,
it's genuinely, Jessa, my dream. Like, you just, like, that is my fantasy. Like, you just came into my brain, and, like, I've been joking about this for years, but, like, sincerely, like, in my work in the nonprofit sector, I'm constantly like, but what if we gave more midwives? Like, what if we put the midwives in charge?
People just know what Robyn's going to suggest now. It's going to be about
always
the midwives.
It is about it's always about Brenda. I love Brenda. She is my Ann Perkins. Like, to be clear, I am real life Leslie Knope. Anyone else takes that title, you're wrong. I am an actual living embodiment of that character, and Ann Perkins is her nurse, and Brenda is my midwife, and I tell her every day how she is a beautiful sun goddess.
Well, shout out to Brenda, the sun goddess. Robyn, you have you're a wealth of knowledge, not just the history of reproductive justice, but where we need to go. I'm excited to share a lot of links because you've kind of given us, you've name dropped, you've book dropped, article dropped, blog dropped, podcast dropped. So, I mean, there's tons of resources that we're going to include in our newsletter to our patrons, but also, along the social media and stuff like that, so that, folks can learn even more. And yeah, I don't know. Maybe we have to carry this conversation on again, talking about specifically the kind of blueprint you talked about that we didn't, maybe bring you back on to give you space to talk about this blueprint specifically. But I do want to thank you, for taking so much information and sharing it with folks. I think the examples you provided at the end, there were really tangible steps where folks can start. Obviously, the work is much more massive than, your family doctor. But if we could only imagine if every individual took that opportunity, those small steps, and often those small steps into activism are what give you the courage to take the next steps and wade deeper and learn and unlearn more. So I was really pleased to kind of get those steps out to folks, because I think a lot of folks, when issues arise like this, the way that the Black Lives Matter not arose as if it was never an issue, but became a waking point for folks. But then they didn't know what to do. Right? They know there's a problem. They know there's a crisis. They know other people are doing work, but they don't know how to insert themselves. So I thank you for all those examples, especially. So, yeah.
Yeah, when I actually will leave, as far as folks just feeling like, if you're hearing me and you're like, wow, this is inspiring, but how do I do what she did? What you just mentioned. So wow, my ADHD is so bad, apparently. I've forgotten all my memories, but through the pandemic. But the first action that I ever did was my then, best friend at Western, Elliot Worsfold, and I were going to the first Women's March in London in 2016. And he said to me, Robyn, I don't want to go if we're just going. Like, what's the point? Like, why would we just go to this? Like, we need to do something while we're there. And that was when Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights had posted this website about the abortion pill and all the restrictions that had been put on it. Because it had just been legalized, but not really, and it was really confusing for doctors, and everything was terrible, and Health Canada had somehow put 18 regulations on, even though they don't do that for cancer meds, but whatever. And so we created a little pamphlet, and he and I went, and we talked to some people at that march. I did a terrible job. He was like, you need to be you need to go up and talk to people, because I was so nervous. And yeah, that was January 2016, 2017. That was the first thing I ever did, was just talking to people about this. And then I went into my family doctor next. That was genuinely the trajectory. And then I set up a meeting with Irene Matheson, who was an MP at the time trying to get birth control to be legal. That was me. I genuinely did that. I was like, hey, maybe I should, my then, but he's a very important person in my life, and we did that for several years together, of just organizing around these issues, and it was because a friend of mine said we can't just we were both TAs at Western in Canadian history, and we were seeing those things, and he was like, we need to do this, and I was like, I guess. And yeah, we had the worst pamphlets I've ever seen. Like, as in, I am so embarrassed by that first doc. Since then, the youths taught me at Western how to use Canva in our various table stuff. Like, genuinely, the youths were like, I was like, what is this magic? What do you have? And now everyone thinks I'm an amazing graphic designer, but I'm actually not. Canva just is really easy to use.
It's worth the monthly fee.
It is. I have it through work, so I'm very lucky.
I like that story, Robyn. I think that's such an explanation, I think, of what could go right with, someone's first foray into activism and what could, go nowhere. And so kudos to your friend for kind of holding you accountable, going, no, you're not just going to get away with writing a plaque, or we are disseminating information at the very least. I may not chain myself to a door my first time out, but I'm going to teach rather than just holler and take a photo to put on my social media. So, and that's really what this show's all about. So I appreciate you kind of making that point that, it's time for people to take that next step, to not just recognize that there's action and perhaps not just vote, but start to influence a little bit broader of a spectrum around them. So
we know that we don't live in a democracy right now in Canada, and that's a whole other podcast, but it's true. To be honest, to end it on this note, the thing I'm actually organizing for next, that I see as a reproductive justice issue and as the issue of our lifetime, Jessa, not climate, and it isn't, climate change is obviously, I'm not going to downplay that or any of the other inequalities. But as a Canadian historian, electoral reform is our issue. We need to ride or die on it. And I know that folks like Fair Vote Canada and stuff have tried, but we need to Morgenthaler this shit. This is I am it is 1970. In 18 years, I want electoral reform. Friggin' the premier of my former province, who is now resigned, John Horgan, messed it up for all of us. My family had no idea what they were voting on. I was educating over the phone to multiple folks. We need to figure it out, and it's going to take time. Yeah, I'm talking about the referendum that the BC NDP had that should have passed, because we know historically in Canada that any large change like that has to happen at a provincial level first. So that is why I was fighting like hell to get Marjorie Knight into office, because I know that the only way that this is going to happen, any of the things we're talking about, they might happen under the current system, but again, it's not democratic, so I don't believe that it will always happen. But I do believe in first reforming, eliminating first past the post, proportional representation, that is the path forward for our movements, and we have to fight for it. As in, let's get the William Lyon Mackenzie inspirations out, guys. And if you don't know who I'm talking about, you need to look him up, and you need to learn about the rebellions, because that's where we're at now. That's how, passionate I am about and so, I talk about abortion, but, that is the movement I will be building in order to get to that place with reproductive justice, because all those other things I just said to you, none of it can happen unless we get electoral reform. That is how life or death, I believe that is for people in terms of our representation and democracy. And so, that's to end on that note. That's part of why I'm creating the Uncampaigned School, because I can scream and yell about abortion all I want, but I don't believe that any of these things are going to change until our democracy is a democracy, and that needs to happen first.
Like in all things that we do, there is a team behind Blueprints of Disruption. I want to give a big thank you to our producers, Santiago Hello Quintero and Jay Woodruff. Our show is also made possible by the support of our listeners. So if you appreciate our content and would like to become a patron, please visit us at www.patreon.com/BP of Disruption. So if you know of any work that should be amplified or want to provide feedback of our show, please reach out to us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. Blueprints of Disruption is a project of New Left Media, an independent employee-owned company.